Thank you. I'm incredibly honored to have been asked to come give a keynote. This is my first IIPF, but hopefully not my last. I've had a really fantastic time, and it's really a great conference. And I'm also incredibly honored to have been introduced by Nadine. When I was a PhD student, I read some of her papers and told my advisor, this is what I want to do. So I've always looked up to her and just very much, you'll see, I like her work quite a bit, and it's all over my slides. So this is actually one of the first keynotes I've ever done. I did one about a month ago. And when I was asked to do these keynotes, I thought at first, like, that's kind of strange, like, aren't I a little too young to do a keynote? Apparently not. So the age I am in my brain is clearly not the age that other people see me at, but I intend to not change that and continue to not act my age. Because this was one of my first keynotes, I decided to ask around for some advice on, what am I supposed to do? So I was told, talk about what you know. So I'm talking about something I've done a lot of work on. I was told, give some advice, give your view of the world. So I'm going to share my thoughts on where the literature has gone and where I think it can go. And my favorite bit of advice that I got was, it was from an economist friend who said, say smart things and don't be boring. Neither of which are particularly my strong suit, so I make no promises whatsoever. In thinking about the topic for today, it was really selfish of me to pick multinational corporate income shifting and kind of a review of the literature, because I realized in the last 5 years or so, I moved, we had a pandemic, I got into a lot of service at my university, and I kind of missed out. I feel like I blinked and there was this huge stack of multinational corporate income shifting papers that I hadn't been able to keep up with. And so this was my credible commitment device to make sure I went back and read those papers and got caught up with the literature, and I'm going to share some of my thoughts with you today. Okay, so a little bit of background about me. You can ignore most of the resume stuff. I was at Texas, I'm back at Texas, okay, enough of that. The most important piece here is the other side, which is that I did have a background in economics, so yes, I'm an accountant, but my first degree was economics, so this isn't entirely foreign to me. And I started my career in economic consulting. And then I worked for 5 years for one of the big four accounting firms, specifically in their transfer pricing group, in the international tax group, advising primarily large multinationals, doing their tax planning and tax compliance, and some state and local in the US as well. We have different tax rates across states, and so we did some transfer pricing for them. So kind of the big picture, as Nadine said, is I'm an accountant. Right, and I have an accounting background. I worked as an accountant for several years before getting my PhD in accounting. So this is going to be very accounting centric. I'm going to be sharing my views on this literature coming from the accounting perspective, which may not always align nicely with your views, and for that, it's kind of my point, to bring a different perspective, and I think that's part of the reason I was asked to do this keynote. All right, so before I dive in, some caveats. I love empirical income shifting research, so that's what I decided to talk about. Second one here is that, if I could get this to work, there we go. Oh, it was there for a second. Right, I can have strong priors based on my lived experience working in accounting, and they may deviate a bit from your priors, so just be forewarned of that. I already said this might be kind of accounting-centric. It's also perhaps a bit US-centric, given that I'm from the US. And to make this keynote a little more interesting, like I try with my podcast, I try with teaching to keep things kind of light and fun and not just lecture. I mean, I'm going to be lecturing, but I'm going to try to link everything back to Ted Lasso. Understanding that not everybody in this audience necessarily knows who Ted Lasso actually is. So don't worry, I'm going to explain. So Ted Lasso is a fictional character, a part of an American TV program through Apple TV. He was an American football coach. But when I say football in America, I mean helmets and shoulder pads and stuff like that, right? And then he was recruited to actually go be a European football coach, like, you know, kicking the ball and all that sort of stuff. So he goes to England and he's the manager of an English football team. And it's a big fish out of water story, an American in England, American football versus European, or I should say rest of the world football, and hilarity ensues. So yeah, one of the things I'm going to have to do with this talk, of course, is to try to convince you all that tax-motivated cross-jurisdictional income shifting is, in fact, like football and Ted Lasso. I'm going to provide some big picture thoughts on the decisions and institutions surrounding income shifting. That's kind of my view of the world. Then we'll get into the view, what do we know, what's already been done, and then my thoughts on what's next, where should we go? Again, very accounting-centric, but that's what you paid for, right? And then I'll wrap up. So that's where we're going. Okay, so why football? Why Ted Lasso? Without going into actually formally writing out a model, this is for you, those of you who might be modelers as opposed to empiricists like me. I like to think of income shifting like kind of a dynamic repeated game like football. So we've got, in my mind, we've got countries on one side of the field, and they are enacting tax policies and trying to come up with tax enforcement. You've got taxpayers, which in this case are multinational corporations, who are trying to comply with the regulations, presumably, and then also trying to avoid tax as well. So you might be looking at this and thinking, are countries really all on the same team? Is that kind of weird? Like, we've got plenty of examples of countries that don't necessarily get along with each other when it comes to tax policies, despite the incredible efforts towards harmonization that we've had over the past 10 years or so. But I think it's true to form. So for those of you who don't know, this is Roy Kent and Jamie Tart, two players of the Richmond football team that Ted Lasso goes to coach in England. And as you can see, they are wearing the same jersey. They're on the same team, but they do not like each other very much for most of 3 seasons of the show. And I think that's true. There are examples in real life as well, all sorts of rumors of football players or teammates of any sport who don't necessarily get along despite playing on the same team. And that's where Ted Lasso comes in. We've got to get somebody who can be kind of the coach, who can bring people together, create a positive culture, you know, get over these differences. And so that's kind of, in my mind, a little bit like the OECD coming in and saying, hey, can we find some agreement? Can we get along? Can we find a way to move forward? And there's been tremendous progress on that. Of course, there are some hangups, some areas where that hasn't quite happened yet. But I think the analogy sort of holds, and hopefully you somewhat agree. Okay, turning to the other side of the field here, you've got our taxpayers. And by the same notion, the taxpayers are not all homogenous, right? They might be playing for the same team in the sense that they're all trying to get their piece of the pie and not pay the tax man or tax person. But there are differences across players. So, and differences across teams, really. So to take an example, we've got an offensive strategy here that was used by FC Richmond. So they're the ones on the right-hand side of the field, if you can see that. And they are lined up in a classic football formation. The problem, it is a classic American football formation. This is not a classic rest of world football formation. And this was an interesting play that they were doing, an offensive strategy to really throw off the defense. And the defense are sitting there, you can look at them, they're talking to each other, what's going on? Why are they lined up this way? And so, yeah, this kind of represents to me the type of multinational corporation that really would do anything to try to save taxes, right? They're willing to be incredibly aggressive with their income shifting. They're willing to bring in plays from other sports, leverage anything they absolutely can in order to avoid taxes, to shift as much profits to low tax jurisdictions as possible. But then you also have on the other side teams, multinationals that can take a more defensive strategy. So this refers to a part of the show where Nate the Great, who ultimately became an assistant coach for the team, despite having started out as their kit manager, if you can believe it, he suggests during a really tense game that they should park the bus. He's calling a play, and he's basically saying, sit back on defense. Let's sit back and wait for our counter-strike opportunity to go score a goal. And it works incredibly well. But that originally was a defensive strategy. And that, to me, is more like the multinational corporations that mostly are concerned with compliance. They're not as interested in being aggressive income shifters, and I'll talk a bit more, about this more later. There is a subset of multinationals that are just much more focused on wanting to stay out of the crosshairs of the tax authorities. They don't want the tax authorities coming after them. They don't want to spend their time on it. They don't want to spend their money on it. And so they end up just being fairly conservative and taking a more defensive strategy, a conservative strategy when it comes to income shifting. All right, hopefully I've convinced you a little bit that income shifting can be like Ted Lasso, and maybe piqued your interest a little bit in checking out Ted Lasso if you haven't seen it yet. So let's turn to my big picture thoughts on the world of profit shifting. And again, this is based on my experience working as a tax advisor for some large firms many years ago at this point, but nonetheless. Okay, so how do I think about this? I presented this slide most of the times I presented any of my income shifting papers. This is the way I view income shifting generally. To me, it's an allocation of income and expenses across related affiliates of a multinational group, and there are two decisions that can be made. First is an operational decision. Where do you locate your operations? I'm talking about people, talking about assets, including tangible assets and intangible assets. I'm talking about your functions, I'm talking about your risks, right? It's, I have the words here, structure the global supply chain in a tax efficient way. And if you were here for Juan Carlos's keynote on Wednesday, you know now that accountants view tax efficiency very differently than economists. So when I say tax efficiency or call something tax efficient, it means the multinational will pay less in taxes. It's basically tax avoidance. And then there's an accounting decision, which is after you take into account the footprint of the firm, you know where their assets are, you know where their people are, their functions and their risks. So now you know what the transactions are, the intercompany transactions that are cross-border and related party, therefore subject to transfer pricing. Now we can talk about the accounting decision. How much do we charge for those transactions? Some of you call this paper profit shifting. To me, this is the bread and butter of accounting. This is the vast majority of what we did. We did do, so back in the tax advisory world, we did do some operational decision planning that happened, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the vast majority of what we did was the accounting decision of how do we price these intercompany transactions. And so, of course, the traditional income shifting strategy shifts income from a high tax affiliate within the multinational group to a low tax affiliate. You save that tax rate differential times the amount of income that you were able to shift. And you're going to do this all day long until the cost of doing that shifting starts to approach or equal the savings, the benefit, the tax benefit of doing the income shifting. Costs, I'll make a quick note here. Costs are generally assumed to be variable costs in convex, but I really like, I'm gonna point out highlight some work during this presentation. I really like Kat's paper with Mike and Narim on a fixed cost component. I think there absolutely is a fixed cost component that we need to be paying attention to, and so I love that they're looking at that. Okay, so then we have an optimization problem, which I've put here in words instead of in equations. firms are going to maximize their global after-tax profits across all of their operations in all of the countries in which they operate. However, firms are obviously subject to many constraints. I have them bucketed into 3 groups here, where they've got enforcement constraints. So you've got regulations, you've got transfer pricing guidelines, which right now at the OECD and in the US rely on the location of functions, risks, and assets for determining where profits get allocated across the firm. You've got transparency efforts like public and private country-by-country reporting and all sorts of other stuff. Then my second bucket is tax frictions. So income taxes, believe it or not, are not the only taxes that multinational corporations have to deal with. We've got customs, duties. They do get involved in some VAT planning. I've got some work on that. And then, there's this compliance versus avoidance focus. How do they view taxes? How do they think about how much they want to optimize against taxes, that sort of stuff. And then the third bucket I have here is non-tax frictions. And this is primarily operational constraints. And this was the biggest hurdle I saw when I was in practice advising firms, is going in for the rare, the large study that you would do. We call them studies projects, where you would go into a firm and you would look at what their footprint is and you say, okay, but if you could reorganize in this particular way, you could save a lot of taxes. And a lot of times that reorganization, yes, involved lower tax jurisdictions or beefing up operations in some of their existing lower tax jurisdictions, moving intellectual property to lower tax jurisdictions. The problem with that is even as far back as 2005, when I started at one of the big 4 accounting firms, the accounting firm that I worked for was very uncomfortable with setting up one of these structures if there were going to be no people there. There was a lot of risk associated with that, and this was back in 2005, right? Clearly that risk has only increased as the international community has had much more of a focus on substance, the people and the functions behind some of the income shifting that's been going on. So the operational constraint was telling a company, the number of times I was in a room or on a call with a VP of tax of a large multinational, telling them, yeah, okay, we can change your structure, we can help you through that, and that will save you a lot of money in taxes. But you're gonna have to actually move, like your head of R&D, for example, to this other country, or you're gonna have to hire somebody locally there to be the head of R&D, because you need actual substance behind your intellectual property in, say, a Switzerland or an Ireland. And they did not like that. A number of times I had a client say, well, how are we gonna move them? They're not gonna wanna move. They live in the middle of America, right? They've got kids. Operational friction. Having to pick up and move certain operations is very difficult and not something that the heads of the companies necessarily wanted to ask of their employees. So that's typically what I think of when I think of non-tax frictions. Okay, how do we identify income shifting? This is obviously a bit of a problem. If it's, maybe it's not obvious, so let me explain. We can't observe it. We observe the profits that companies report, either in their financial statements or to tax authorities. Those profits that we see presumably are net of some amount of profit shifting, but we don't know how much. So we have to come up with some truth, some amount of income that we think is the right amount of income in that country or in that affiliate before all this profit shifting happened. And there are different approaches to doing this. My preferred approach is to do an estimate of true income or an estimate of true prices if you happen to have transactional level price data, and then correlate a deviation of what you see from what you estimate or what you think is truth. You want to correlate that deviation with tax incentives, right? And that should be tax-motivated income shifting. And there's plenty of approaches that go back a long time to doing this. There have been also some incredible model improvements over time, things to address things like nonlinearities in the tax semi-elasticity of profits, the inclusion of zero profit or loss-making firms, endogeneity, all sort of that sort of stuff. And then there are alternative approaches that use proxies that have been shown to be positively correlated with income shifting, and more simplistic proxies, and I don't mean that necessarily in a bad way. Things like the use of intercompany lending or holding companies, the use of tax haven affiliates, having profits near zero, which you would think probably is a little suspect. Why would all these profits of affiliates be near zero? Probably, especially if they're in high tax countries, that's probably because they've been shifting and come out, and things like that. Another approach is to assign profits based on the location of sales, assets, and people. That's more of a bottoms-up approach, looking at the footprint of the firm. And I'll just say, from an accounting perspective, from a law perspective, it's a very reasonable approach to look at the footprint of the firm versus where the profits are located. But if we think of what the transfer pricing regulations currently say, what the current law is, it's not based on sales, assets, and people. It's functions, risks, and assets. It's similar, but not exactly the same. So talking about the deviation of profits from the location of sales, assets, and people, certainly indicative of income shifting, but I wouldn't go so far as to call it non-compliance, because it would be compliant with the regulations that we have today. All right, moving into the review of what's been done. And as I was thinking about starting to compile this whole list of papers, this is Ted sitting on the couch of his therapist, the team therapist. He's overwhelmed by life and everything. And that's kind of what I looked like when I started putting my list of papers together. It's a ginormous list of papers, not just from the last few years, but going way, way, way back. So I tried to make myself feel a little bit better by reining in my scope just a touch. I'm focusing on empirical income shifting research, so apologies to the theorists out there. And ideally, those that have an empirical income shifting prediction model. I'm going to show examples of papers that don't have that in these slides, but that's kind of my preferred approach. I excluded for now papers limited to a single industry. Those tend to be banking, insurance, oil, and gas. And then I focus mostly on main results, not on additional tests. So as I was categorizing papers, yes, they might have table 12 doing something else, but I tried to focus on what the main point of the paper was. And one that's not on here, but probably a little bit obvious for this crowd and from the title of my paper, is I don't include state and local income shifting across US states. So it's really across international lines that I'm interested in. And as I was compiling this list, it just kept growing and growing and growing. So going all the way back to 1989 here, this is the cumulative number of top publications. So this isn't the number of publications in each year, right? It's growing because it's the cumulative number over time. And this is my weird definition of top publications that may not align with yours. And so now I've got all publications across any journal that I could find. So anytime I found a paper, I went through the references list, added those papers to my list, opened them up, looked at them, went through the references list. And so yeah. And then when you add in the working papers, I'm at over 260 right now in my list. And you could see that my attempt to just catch up on like the last 5 years, that was a lot of papers. It's a lot of working papers. This is a huge and growing area. And I think that's incredibly exciting. We've had some tremendous reforms and policies intended to address multinational corporate income shifting. A lot of these papers focus on that. We've had some incredible advances in our technologies that we're using to approach these problems. But we have a huge number of working papers here. And so one key thing that I'm going to try to focus on in terms of my advice portion of the keynote is to try to outline the areas that are less crowded. So if this is a space that you're working in or that you want to work in, where can you find more easily that incremental contribution that could yield you a publication and that can yield us new information about multinational corporate income shifting. But this is a huge field. So what do we know about income shifting? Shift happens. This is Ted Lasso drinking tea, and no matter how many times he drinks tea, he discovers that, yep, he still hates tea. He's a coffee guy. No matter how many times we examine income shifting, it seems like we seem to find, companies are shifting income. Yep, it's happening. Okay. So we've got some great stuff here. And as I said, there have been some great advances in terms of the approaches of identification. I think that's super important. But I think now we need, and we have been, but if you're new to this space, consider moving beyond just identifying the income shifting that's happening and start diving into new nuances and areas of income shifting. We also know that enforcement and regulations matter quite a lot. Much like the yellow cards and red cards in football, it has a big effect on the play of the game. So we've got a whole bunch of published papers, a whole bunch of working papers. The working paper list is actually bigger here, at least, than this isn't all the papers on my list, right? These slides would be teeny, teeny, tiny font. So I picked some representative papers. What to point out here, this is an important area. It really is. It's also a crowded area. So where do we focus if we're trying to push literature forward? I think we need to focus on areas that are a little bit unclear, and I'll point out at least one of those later on in my slides, where we're not entirely sure, there's some conflicting evidence, but by and large, enforcement and regulations matter. By and large, we find that they have an effect, but it may not always be the intended effect, and that is another very interesting area, I think. So if you can find an unintended effect of these regulations, or an area where we really don't know yet if the regulation had its intended effect, I think that's where to focus on when it comes to enforcement and regulation. There's also been a tremendous amount of work done on mechanisms and channels of income shifting. This is just the first slide, which I limited to the different types of transactions. You've got intangibles transactions, intercompany capital shifts, so intercompany debt, and then intercompany transfers of goods and services. We've been able to document that income shifting happens through all of these different types of transactions that are in the transfer pricing regulations, the ones that have been identified by tax authorities of here's how you're supposed to price them. Yep, all of them are being used by multinationals. Other mechanisms and channels, this is not an exhaustive list, but risk shifting, I love this paper because it goes back to the regulations. How is profit supposed to be allocated across a firm? It's based on the functions, risks, and assets. And we've focused a lot on people and functions, and we've focused a lot on assets, but we focused a lot less on risk shifting. And so I think that was a really nice piece to add to the literature. There's also been increasing work in the last couple of years on the use of hybrid structures where basically income can be viewed as not taxable income on one side of a transaction, but it's a deduction on the other side of the transaction, so it's win-win for the taxpayer. That's just one example of the type of hybrid structure. Shift to loss, I've got some work. So you have an affiliate that's a loss-making affiliate, they're not paying taxes, you can bring them all the way up to zero by shifting profit into them and pay no extra tax in that jurisdiction and save all of the taxes in the jurisdiction you shifted from. The use of different types of transaction terms for intercompany transactions, who bears the risk of loss during the shipment of the goods, who's going to insure it, that sort of stuff. Foreign R&D and employment, stock-based compensation, and lots more that I don't have on these slides. So we have quite a bit here on mechanisms and channels. So this is an area that's become quite crowded. The interesting areas here to push forward, I think the hybrid structures is great. We haven't had data on that. So an area where you could get new insightful data into the inner workings and inner structure of multinational corporations, I think that can really add to the literature. But otherwise, be a little bit careful thinking about mechanisms and channels. This is a crowded space, so just make sure you have a good incremental contribution, something to add here. Determinants. This is an even more crowded area. We have lots of information on determinants. So the ownership of an intellectual property is, of course, a big one. Ownership and location. And then more from the accounting side, corporate governance and decision rights. I think this is something that we're very interested in, is how are decisions actually made within the firm? Who's making the decision? How do they think about it? So that might be something that you all could contribute to the accounting space and to the income shifting space more generally. Also, as accountants, we're really interested in market effects, so financial reporting incentives and how the market responds to what the company is publicly disclosing in their financial statements, which is impacted by their income shifting decisions and behavior. Non-income taxes, I mentioned that, things like customs and VAT. More determinants. Enforcement, we would include here things like transparency, corporate social responsibility. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Other things here, headquarters location. I love those papers too. Tax holidays, the use of tax advisors. Even more determinants. Yep. Lots and lots of determinants here. The font's getting smaller and smaller, and there's still even more in my list of papers that are not included on here. This is the most crowded space that I've uncovered so far in my literature review. I'm not saying don't work on determinants. I have working papers on determinants, but think very carefully about how your paper contributes to the literature. It's a very, very, very crowded space. Consequences. I think this is a tremendously interesting area. We know quite a bit about consequences, but I think this is an area that could get pushed quite a bit further. So some of the earliest work talked about how corporate income shifting impacts the valuation of the firm. There's been a lot about the location decisions of the firm. So where do they decide to locate their debt, their intangibles, their risk, their affiliates? Obviously, investment and employment, real effects, misalignment of real activities and profits. These are all really interesting, but becoming more and more crowded with papers. Really interesting stuff on aggregate measurements, how income shifting has impacted, say, measures of GDP, right? Super important to the economy. Affiliate level earnings management, this is more of an accounting thing. So, how does income shifting impact the financial reporting decision and trying to meet or beat earnings? Investor information quality, investment efficiency, right? There's a good number of consequences that have been done, that have been studied, particularly in recent years, but I think there's a lot more here. Think outside the box. In accounting, I think we should be doing more looking at market effects. So I really like this paper, the Chen et al. Paper on investor information quality. And it kind of harkens back to Collins Kemsley Lang, in accounting anyway, one of the seminal income shifting papers that says, okay, you're shifting income across borders, but how are investors looking at your reported earnings in those jurisdictions? How are they valuing it? And it makes it more murky, right? If you're distorting where you're reporting profits, and we might put a different multiplier on, say, US profits versus non-US profits, that impacts investor valuations, it impacts their information environment. And I think that's a really interesting area. But I'd love to see more on the consequences of income shifting. So I've already said a few things about where I think the literature could go. And now I'm going to focus really on, okay, what next, right? Some other areas that I think we should do. All right, so not all firms shift income, but it's not just the largest ones. I'll say more on that in a moment. Not all income gets shifted to tax havens. I want to dive deeper into the black box of how decisions are made. I mentioned that already. And then I'll highlight quickly some unexplored areas. So not all firms shift income. Remember, we've got our taxpayers on one side and our countries on the other side. And I said earlier that taxpayers are not homogenous, they're quite different. And just to back up, I think we have a tendency to do two things when we think about who's shifting income. We either look at a coefficient in a large sample regression and we see evidence of income shifting and we know it's an on average effect, econometrically we know that's an on average thing, but then we go ahead and make the sweeping conclusion that everybody's doing it. We know that's not true. Econometrically, we know that's not true, but we make that assumption. Or we do the alternative and we say, well, it's not everybody, but it's really just the largest, biggest, primarily US multinationals. Also not true. Based on my experience, not true. Okay, so we've got heterogeneity. This is the dynamic and interactive portion of the presentation. Who knows who this is? Yes, say it out loud. Danny Rojas. And what is Danny Rojas's favorite line? What is his mantra? Football is life. This is the player on the fictional FC Richmond team. This is the player. Football is life. His world revolves around football. It's all he wants to do. It makes him happy. Football's also death, but football is life, right? If you haven't seen the show, never mind. Okay. This is your multinational that's willing to be aggressive. They're willing to move heaven and earth to do anything to shift one more dollar of income. And yes, they do exist. There are super aggressive taxpayers out there willing to do everything, things that sometimes you as the advisor are uncomfortable with and not willing to do, right? So that's one type of taxpayer. But then we also have another example from the show, Jamie Tart. Jamie Tart's the Playboy player. He's the one who goes and does reality TV shows. He gets distracted by women. He gets distracted by, let's face it, shiny objects. He's the one that maybe football isn't life. Maybe we've got other things going on at the firm. There were plenty of clients back in the day, and I can't name any names or anything, but plenty of clients, we go tell them, all right, it's going to be a big project. We can restructure things, help you restructure in a, again, accounting words, tax efficient way. And you're going to pay us a lot of money, but you're going to save so much more. They didn't want to hear it. The return on investment was enormous. Even in a couple years, it's going to pay for itself. I've got other things to do. It's too risky. We're putting out fires over here. They just don't want to hear it. So there are different types of taxpayers out there. Not all taxpayers are shifting income. And it's not just cute quotes from Ted Lasso. We've got a lot of research saying that not all firms are interested in being aggressive income shifters. So survey evidence, firms vary in taking offensive versus defensive income shifting strategies. This other paper does a firm level estimate of profit shifting. This isn't profit, this is profit shifting. And notice the huge spike at zero. Zero estimated profit shifting is the big spike, though it's a bimodal distribution at least, but there's a huge spike at zero. There's plenty of firms that aren't doing income shifting. This is the same paper that Juan Carlos talked about on Wednesday. I really like this paper. Basically, there was a new regulation for transfer pricing in Chile. Basically, for the first time, they were going to start enforcing it. And instead of income shifting going down, it went up. Why did it go up? Because now suddenly transfer pricing was salient to the companies. They had to go pay the tax advisors to do compliance for the new enforcement anyway, and so they might as well start doing some planning around it. Some of the quotes, companies were only focused on compliance prior to the regulation. Management often doesn't want to think about taxes. Shock of all shocks. Not everybody wants to talk about taxes all the time. Many companies started to basically engage in income shifting once the regulations came along and they started thinking about it. Again, not all companies are shifting income, and this was a great example of a shock that came in and made more companies actually want to start shifting income. Not all firms have a flexible enough cost structure to shift income. Some firms have frictions that other firms don't have. Some firms, this is a working paper by Jillian Adams, some firms are willing to publicly disclose country-by-country reporting voluntarily to signal that they are not aggressively shifting income. They want to tell the market that we're not shifting income. That's how much they want to be conservative. So not all firms are shifting income. And it's not just the largest firms. Different paper by Jillian Adams, firms of all sizes are shifting income. It's not just the big ones. There's a nice jar paper, more income shifting among smaller firms. Skip ahead here to the clarifications. Okay, because this is the part I feel like it's going to get me most in trouble. I'm not saying that the largest firms don't account for a large share of profits being shifted. Of course they do. They have more profits to shift, okay? I'm also not saying there's not a fixed cost component to income shifting. What do I mean by that? There's a barrier to entry. So it's easier for a larger firm to shift income if they're willing to pay that cost to do the types of studies, the projects that need to be done, hire the tax advisors to put everything together and manage their risk. Okay, I'm not saying any of that. That's all true. But it isn't just the big firms that people like to focus on. And whether we should focus only on these firms, I think really depends on the policy and the question being asked. The concern I have is that a lot of the policies now are focused on just those large firms. And yes, that's the biggest leak that we have, so let's plug that leak. But as soon as we plug it, if we're only focusing on those firms, we're gonna have a whole bunch of leaks everywhere else. It's not all going to tax havens. This is Zava. He's like one of the best players in the world. He comes to FC Richmond, it's this huge win. It's gonna be so easy, we're gonna win every game because he's the best. And it's not a good fit for the team. In the same way, tax havens aren't always a good fit. Let's skip ahead on that slide. Tax havens aren't always a good fit for the multinational. Slemrod 92, they're gonna start with their existing footprint. They're not gonna start by picking up and moving things to another place. They're gonna start with their existing footprint and do that accounting transaction, optimizing their transfer pricing first. And they may not have operations in a tax haven. Or they may not have operations in the perfect tax haven for whatever strategy they wanna do. Shifting from high to low is always gonna save taxes. Right? Whether it's the highest of the high or the lowest of the low, it's gonna save taxes to shift from high to low. So there's lower transaction and planning costs to using what they have, and sometimes there's just not a tax haven to be found. And you don't have to take my word for it, there's plenty of evidence in the literature that they're shifting to low tax country, not necessarily deemed tax havens. Just take any study that relies on Amadeus Europe. Okay, we can argue about labeling some countries in Europe, but a lot of those observations we don't see anyway. And we still find evidence of income shifting. So it's not all going to tax havens. Other studies show significant amount of profits, a significant amount of low tax profits in non-haven jurisdictions. Of course, there's a whole debate about how we're assessing magnitudes, but the Blue and Robinson paper says estimated profits to shifted to tax havens are overstated. And I'll skip the rest of this in the interest of time. But it's not all going to tax havens. So let's delve inside the black box. Okay, you don't need to see my picture, it's fine. I don't even remember what it was. So if it's not all firms and it's not all being shifted to tax havens, let's explore the heterogeneities and frictions a little bit more deeply. And I personally would love to know more about how these decisions are being made within the firm. Can we show that more empirically? So some examples here. I've got some surveys and semi-structured interviews. I think that's super nice. You may call it just anecdotal evidence, but it helps us dig into what companies are actually thinking about when they're making these decisions. So I've got 2 survey papers and a semi-structured interview paper. That's the one Juan Carlos talked about on Wednesday. Doesn't have to be surveys and anecdotal evidence. The recent JEE paper, Kohlhausen and Wilhofer, they get all pricing data from a single firm, and they can track the prices through the firm to see when certain add-ons are being made, who's making the decision. It's a super cool paper. And then a recent paper using tax return data to identify hybrid transactions and hybrid entities. I had mentioned that, like new data on stuff that we couldn't see before. Really, really cool. But it doesn't all have to be surveys and super cool data. I think there are some interesting frictions and non-tax costs that we can focus on. I'm just highlighting a couple here. So we've got 2 papers looking at the interplay between corporate social responsibility and multinational corporate profit shifting, and they come to different conclusions about the sign of that association. So that's a nice area to explore a little bit more. I already mentioned the quality of information to investors. I think that's super interesting. And then private firms. We tend to focus so much on public firms. What about private firms? They have very different incentives, at least when we're thinking about their relation to the market and how they're reporting their profits. That plays a huge role. So this paper finds more income shifting by private firms because they have lower financial reporting costs. That's an interesting area to explore. So Underexplored areas, I already mentioned conflicting evidence on corporate social responsibility. We've got conflicting evidence on whether country-by-country reporting deters income shifting. I think that needs to be teased out. And then, of course, the big debate on the magnitude of income shifting, which I am not going to wade into. That would take up the whole hour. More underexplored areas, developing economies. I know Nadine is working a little bit in this area, and I believe you have a chapter reviewing what's been done already. There needs to be more here. This is super important to the global economy. Private firms already mentioned. Smaller firms, that's the Adams working paper and the JAR paper. Focus a little bit more on small firms. What are they doing? Why are they doing it? These all seem like underexplored areas where it would be easier to carve out an incremental contribution. And that's the goal. Okay, I'm almost done. Let me just conclude. Income shifting research, it is growing massively, which I think means people are really interested in it. I think that's good. I think we can move forward by exploring those heterogeneities across firms and interesting frictions, conflicting results, understudied economies, understudied firms like those small firms and private firms. And let's dig a little bit deeper to learn more about how income shifting decisions are being made. Closing plug number one, I have two. Okay, I have the floor, so I get to shamelessly plug whatever I want. I'm the senior editor of the Journal of the American Taxation Association, and we would love to have a wider set of submissions, particularly from economists. So please consider us as an outlet for your work. We're fairly friendly, we're fairly quick. I believe we're fairly inexpensive to submit to, so we welcome your submissions. Nadine already did this a little bit for me, but closing plug number two, listen to my podcast. Taxes for the Masses, available wherever you get your podcasts. Believe it or not, two people sitting around talking about taxes doesn't have to be boring. We try to have fun with it. We make jokes. We occasionally sing. I probably shouldn't have said that. That'll keep you away from us. But yeah, check us out. And I think with that, I will open it up for questions.
So you didn't talk much about policy implications, and I didn't watch Ted Lasso, but I think it had three pillars, 3 seasons. So do you have ideas for what the 2 pillars, how they work, and especially like what is missing going forward in terms of addressing issues related to income shifting kind of globally?
So I would lump that, to me, I'd lump that into what I call the regulation and enforcement piece. We could call it policy, include that in there. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done on the potential implications of these policies. I've already seen quite a bit. So I'm one of the, I forget the fancy name, one of the organizers for international sections for the National Tax Association conference coming up in November. And there were a tremendous amount of submissions on the global minimum tax. So I'm very happy to see a lot of work being done in that space, mostly predictive right now, because I think it hasn't quite started yet. But yeah, I think I think we're going to need a lot of work in these areas. I don't know, is that you meant what is missing in terms of the research, or what is missing in terms of policy? Yeah, all I can say there is to reiterate what I said before, that yes, we're focusing on the biggest leak right now, but I think we're going to have a lot more leaks popping up after we hopefully start to close down what's going on with the largest multinationals. I don't know in aggregate how big that's going to be compared to, the top 10 multinationals, but I think it's still going to be pretty big. And I think I know these firms are shifting income. It's just they have less profit to shift, so it's a smaller number. But does that mean we shouldn't be focusing on them? I think that's probably the direction things are going to go. But if we can get agreement, right? I'm fully aware that I'm from the United States up here talking about global minimum tax, which we're in, we're out, we're in, right? So who knows?
So perhaps like a bit related to that point. So we've seen all these initiatives over recent years trying to shut down on profit shifting. And like a gap that I always thought like is a big gap in the literature is on the compliance burden that all these regulations entail. I don't know what is, so it was not on your list, and I just wondered what you think about it.
I think that's an amazing idea. Yeah. You know, ideally, a policy's benefits should outweigh the costs. And we seem to have no problem, generally speaking, in kind of using a generic we here, of imposing those costs on the firms. And it is quite costly. So an analysis that tries to evaluate the costs, particularly for that large swath of firms that aren't the bad guys, that aren't engaging in all that income shifting, and comparing it to the benefits, I think is very important.
Yeah, thank you for keeping the talk so interesting. It was one of the last talks. It was very good. And from a question, you showed the graph of the profit shifting and said that there's the zero is a very strong factor. I had a slight experience with transfer pricing and saw that a lot of the operational decisions, for example, in pharma, have been done years ago. And there's not very much to profit shift anymore, if you say from the operational side. Is there literature which has looked into this to say, we look at certain industries, is there very much operational decisions still to be done, or are they already optimized from that sense? And we've been looking in the literature, are they still doing tax avoidance because we can't get at the operational anymore?
That's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought of it that way. A lot of those structures, yes, they put those structures in place years ago operationally to optimize their footprint so that they could shift as much as possible. But those structures last a long time. Like that's kind of the other side of the fixed cost component of income shifting is, yes, there might be a high barrier to entry, but once you do it, unless everything really changes, which maybe, you know, there's an argument to be made that things are changing enough that companies are having to change their operations again. But I think those benefits tend to last for a long time, so they can continue shifting and we can continue picking that up. But you're right, operationally, you're gonna have to look for companies that haven't already made the leap, or things like perhaps the global minimum tax that really changes the incentives for how you've structured your operations for the last 20, 30 years.
So there's not that much literature looking at how optimized are they operationally, looking at the general economy. So you could say as a percentage.
I have nothing comes to mind. I mean, yes, we have plenty of studies showing that firms on average have located their affiliates, their assets, their intellectual property, their risks, their debt in the right places to optimize income shifting. But in terms of trying to quantify what portion of the economy is that, nothing is coming to mind. I may have missed something, but yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much for a very entertaining lecture.